Hello. Surprise.
Really?
Surprise.
Oh my gosh,
Looking back now, there are moments in life where everything changes. Sometimes you know what's happening, but most of the time you have no idea. For me, it was a little blue pill. It was something that was the size of my pinky nail. And I can tell you that I had absolutely no idea what it was about to cost me. By this point in my life, I was only 23 years old, but I was already exhausted. If you listen to the last episode, we talked about how my little brother and I lived in my car for 3 months until I figured out how to get into my first place. I was 19, my brother was 8. Where we're gonna pick back up, we had been, living in our first place for a little while now. And during this time, our dad actually got his stuff together for a little bit, and he had gotten a house in the Headlands. And so my brother ended up moving in with him. I was back at a point in my life where I didn't really have any stability. The time from when we got our first place, to where we're at now, the most amount of stability my brother and I had experienced up until this point was when we were living in our first place. Now, mind you, it was still chaos, okay? I was still 19, 20, 21 years old doing 19, 20, and 21-year-old stuff, okay? I still had not stopped selling drugs. I was selling pot still at the time, so there was always people in and out of my house. I was driving my brother to school every morning and picking him up after school at the library. I remember I would end up staying up all night because I was afraid that I wouldn't wake up in the morning in time to get him to school. And like I said before, I was so adamant about not letting my brother go into child protective services. So it was just so ridiculous. There were some mornings where I was driving him to school, just absolutely delirious. One morning, I'm driving him to school, and his school was off of Route 84, and we had gotten to the stoplight, the last stoplight, before you turned into the school. And there was always a long line of cars at the stoplight because, there were buses coming in the school, out of the school, and all the parents that brought their kids to school, they were dropping their kids off at school. So we would always have to sit in this long line of cars. And I was so tired this one morning that I was in traffic. I had my foot on the brake and I fell asleep. And I thought the car in front of me started to drive. So I woke up in a panic and I started to go forward. Well, I ended up rear-ending the car in front of me. And at the time, I totally did not have it together, okay? I would have told you I did, but I didn't have no car insurance. I might have had my license at that point, but there's a really good chance that I was driving without a valid license as well. So, needless to say, that day my brother didn't make it to school because I did not make the turn into the school. The light turned green and I kept going straight. And to my surprise, the car that I rear-ended, they didn't stop either. So they must have been in a similar situation than I was in. That's just an example of the chaos that I'm talking about, okay? So now, fast forward, my brother is living in the Headlands with my dad, and I was in between places. I was in a relationship, and my dad and I, we never really had a good relationship, He used to take me everywhere with him. He used to take me fishing all the time to the craziest fishing spots. And then as soon as I was old enough to be able to talk, my mom used to trick me into telling on him for smoking pot, so he stopped hanging out with me. And then the next time we had anything in common was when I was 16 years old. And that's when him and I smoked pot together for the first time. So, we never really had a relationship. We never really had anything in common except for we both like to get high. So during this time that we're talking about now, him and I had kind of rekindled our relationship a little bit, because the only time my father has ever shown me any respect or even hinted that he was proud of me was when I had my first place and I had full custody of my little brother. Now, he was dating this young girl who was younger than I was at the time. And like I said, I was in my early 20s. And so she was younger than me, this girl was. And I feel so bad for this girl. My dad tortured this lady. Anyways, so during the time when I had my first place, I know I'm jumping a little bit all over the place. So I'm just trying to paint a picture for you. So during the time when I had my first place, my dad would come over a couple times a month. And he would buy food and put food in my fridge, and him and his girlfriend would stay a couple nights, and we would cook out. And it was honestly awesome. It was awesome. It was the best our relationship, father-son wise, had ever been, ever in my entire life. And then still up to this date, that time, we don't have a relationship now. I haven't talked to him in 5 years, but that time that I'm speaking of right now still remains the best time as far as the relationship him and I had together. He would come over to my house and he would literally take his shoes off in my house, and I felt respected from him, and I never ever felt that. I always felt like I was trying to get his approval no matter what, and that was the only time I felt like I ever had it. So, leading up to where we're at now, as far as my brother going to stay with him, our relationship was still in good standing from the time that I'm telling you about when I had my first place. So what ended up actually happening was I ended up actually going and living with him for a couple of months, because I had gotten a landscaping job in Chesterland. And like I said, I was in a relationship, so we were looking for a place. Well, it was cool for a while. I had my dogs over there. Everything was cool. We would eat dinner as a family. It was honestly, I cherished that time. I look back on that time with fond memories. But just like always, that only lasted so long, and our relationship ended up souring. And I don't remember everything, every detail. I think, our brains have a defense mechanism built in to where, we just block stuff out. But I do remember what ended up actually causing us to leave there was an issue that we had with our dogs. And it's a crazy story, honestly. So one of my dogs that I had, she was a black lab and German shepherd, and I ended up getting this dog from my mom. And the dog was conceived and born at the place where my mom was staying at. And in the last episode, I talked about what led up to my mom leaving my brother to stay with my grandma. Was she ended up going with this guy who eventually strung her out on drugs. And it turns out that guy and my dad were actually friends in high school. Well, my mom and dad never officially divorced. Still to this day, on paper, they're still married. But, when they separated, they never got back together. My mom ended up being with this guy that I'm telling you about. And that's where the dog came from. So my dad hated that dog. I can't tell you why or his thought process behind it, but I do know that he completely resented that dog because it probably reminded him of my mom and that whole situation. So he had a red-nosed pit bull at the time. She was vicious. And I found out through one of my friends that my dad was intentionally leaving rawhides out when we were all at work, because he hoped that the dogs would fight over him and the red-nosed pit bull would injure my lab shepherd. And the way I found out was one of my good friends worked with my dad, and he told me about it. He's like, bro, you can't tell your dad I'm telling you this, but I overheard him at work saying that he is purposely leaving rawhides out when you guys go to work because he's hoping that the pit bull attacks your dog. And when me and my girlfriend at the time found that out, it was a wrap. We had to get up out of there as quickly as we could. So we end up getting a place in Newberry, Ohio, which was where she was originally from. I had never heard of the place, but it was awesome, honestly. It was one of my favorite places that I ever had. It was this little 1-bedroom cottage, and I had a balcony. We were on the top level. It was a duplex, so there was an apartment below us, and we were on the top. And I had a balcony, a back porch with a hammock on it, and my grill, and my backyard ended into a lake. We lived in a little lake community called Restful Lake. And it was awesome, dude. I had a little boat. We had she had a paddleboard, and dude, life was good for a little while there. There was still chaos, okay? And I didn't realize it at the time. You know, I was not looking for a drug. I was looking for relief. I'll never forget the first time I took a Percocet. So before we get to that, the friend that I just mentioned who told me that my dad was trying to get my dog hurt, that was his DOC. It was opiates. And still at this time, I had no clue about opiates. I was just a pothead. I smoked and I sold and I smoked a lot of pot. And I remember I had one of my birthdays at the Punderson campground. And I had this little 10-foot flat bottom John boat with the trolling motor hardwired into it, the interstate marine battery. It was awesome, man. It was perfect. It fit 3 people in it, and we used to go out fishing in it, and it was so cool, man. And I remember, you know, we're all chilling at the campsite, and my buddy's like down bad, and I'm like, what's up, dude? And he's like, oh, nothing. I'm waiting for my dad to get here. And I'm like, what's up? And he's like, I'm waiting for my dad to get here. And to make a long story short, I didn't know at the time, but he was waiting for his dad to bring him some pills. He was going through withdrawal, and I did not understand it at the time. I'm like, dude, let's go. I got a bag of weed, dude. Let's, you know, what are you waiting for? And he's like, bro, I'm waiting for my dad to get here. So, like I said, that was like my best friend at the time. So him and I hung out a lot. His dad was dating this woman who lived in Concord, and she had a prescription. She would get 120 Perc-30s every month, and 2.5 weeks into the month, she would already be out. So she would send my friend Brendan and I down to Youngstown in her Lincoln with $2-3 grand, enough money to buy an old Civic. And we'd go down there and buy big bags of these perks. Well, I still wasn't doing them at the time, but I would just go because me and Brendan were hanging out. And like I said, to make a long story short, sooner or later, curiosity got the best of me. I remember the day, man, I'm like, let me try one of those. I'll never forget what Brendan said to me. He goes, I don't know, bro. Once you have the knowledge, you can't unknow it. I'm like, what? Dog, there's nothing on this planet that the size of my pinky nail is gonna stop me from doing anything. Let me get one. He's like, you know, I don't know, bro. I'm telling you, dude, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. My ego was bigger than a building. You know, I'm a grown man, you ain't tell me what I'm gonna not do and gonna do, but let me get one, man. Eventually he caved in and he gave me one. And I remember I took half of it, and it made me nauseous. And this lady that I'm telling you about, her name was Helen, and she was a sweet lady, but she was sick. She was an addict, you know. And misery loves company. But she had a mansion in Concord, and that's where we would hang out. She had a movie theater in the basement where if you turned all the lights off, there were no windows. It was completely pitch black. I remember I would take a half of these things, and I'd have to go down there and just recline the theater seating and just sit in the dark and ride that nausea wave out. And then once the nausea passed, I felt like Superman. It was crazy. I couldn't believe it. The sky was bluer. Food tasted better. Cigarettes were better. The noise that came out of the hole in people's face was more tolerable. It It made everything better. I felt like Superman on these things. I could tear a house down and rebuild it, and I'm not a carpenter. And like I said earlier, sometimes moments in your life, it's a situation, it changes everything, and you have no idea. I could have never known the severity of the situation that I had just gotten myself into, that I begged for. You know, and it talks about in the big book, you know, I had arrived. Well, this was that for me. I had arrived. That was my moment right there. I think a misconception about addicts is, you know, people think that, you know, addiction starts because, you know, somebody wants to ruin their life, or they know what they're even doing at the time. And that's not what happened to me. You know, I thought I had it under control. I thought I knew it all. I thought there wasn't nothing that you could tell me about any drug or anything for that matter. You know, I'm 23 years old and I had already experienced homelessness, jail, almost prison, probation, and raising a kid that I did not birth. You know, so needless to say, my ego was bigger than a building. Addiction started for me because for the first time in a long time, that weight that was just crushing me always, because I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, it dissipated. It was gone. For however long that high lasted, when I would take that little tiny piece of a pill, I didn't feel that weight of the world that I was carrying around on my shoulders. I'm a human. I'm only human. You know, left to my own devices, you know, I don't have a relationship with God. I don't know that there are people that I could go to for help. I believe that I got to figure this out. It's just me carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. I'm responsible for my brother's life. It did a number on me. Irreparable damage. The lie wasn't that Percocet would destroy me. If I would have known that or understood that at the time, I would have never touched it. You know, the lie I was telling myself and that I fully believed was that it was helping me. I was more productive on it. You know, it is an insidious lie. This is like one of the ways I think about it. You know, it's evil. Somehow they figured out how to stuff all of the best feelings that you can feel as a human into this little tiny pill. I know now that that is artificial. There's only one way to have that feeling that isn't synthetic, and that is knowing God. Jesus Christ. For me, Jesus Christ. Jesus is the only thing that fills that hole that we all have, okay? To be in service of others. You can only wake up to serve your own selfish desires for so long. It is not sustainable. You cannot sustain it. That's not why we were made. We were made to serve others. That is why we're here, especially if you're a man. I'm talking to the men right now. If you're a man, biologically, you were put here to be a protector, a provider, and a role model. And when you are in active addiction, you are serving yourself. You are a parasite, just sucking the life out of everything around you. You know, I would make deals with myself. And for a long time, I sustained it. I held it together for a long time. You know, it would only be 3 days a week, right? That's what it was. Like I said, I was landscaping at the time. I would only allow myself to partake with you know, my Percocet habit that I was developing 3 days a week. It became 4 days a week. And then 5 days a week. And then multiple times a day, every day of the week. And then it became all of my time and energy went towards that. I started neglecting my relationship and any other responsibility that I may have had at that time. I do remember the first time that I noticed something was changing in me, though. I started to have turmoil in my relationship. I still didn't know what it felt like to go through withdrawal yet, but it got to the point to where I couldn't even go to work unless I had something. You know what I mean? It was fun at first. It was so fun at first. Those 3 days that I would allow myself at work, oh my God, it was the best days at work. I couldn't wait to go to work. It was great. It was great. The sun shined brighter. The birds were just singing beautiful songs. The people that I had to work with, I was their best friend. But those 2 days where I didn't have it, I started noticing myself barely being able to get to work on time. And then I started harassing my buddy, you know, the one who gave him to me, because he worked right around the corner. The first time I realized that I was not taking Percocet because I wanted to anymore, I was taking it because I felt like I needed to. And those were those days where if I didn't have something, I was barely going to work. And then it got to the point to where if I didn't have something, I wasn't going to work. That scared me because deep down I knew that I was losing control. It became something bigger than I could have ever imagined it ever could be. Because before long, I was not chasing a high anymore. I was barely surviving. I was trying to survive. That is when things really start to get dark. But there was still, there was deep state, the lady, he was, so I'm like, dog, there's nothing on the size of this planet. Oh, okay. Somehow they figured out how to, and then the first time I remember, okay.